Alright, it's been over a year and 4 months since I made my last long-form video, The Road to Nowhere, which in truth is the real beginning, of the road to 315, from the cleanish 245, all the way to where I am now, at 275. I spent about 8 months training listlessly, doing different variations in hypertrophy rep ranges, training the upper body 3 times a week, always with presses, a bunch of different presses, and training the chest in priority, with the triceps having been put to the side because they had grown a significant amount before this and had yielded no bench PR, so I assumed it must be the chest that was the problem. This still did not work. Even after all of this time of training the chest, it still did not yield results, despite it having been quite a long time, even before the Road to Nowhere video. However, in the last 7 months, I've begun to make progress again. I've officially been training for well over 4 years now. My anniversary was back in November last year. I was 4 years. And I've made some conceptual progress since then, but I've also been confounded. I'd like to give some shout outs first to Alpha Destiny, Alex Leonidas, who taught me a lot about exercise selection, about intensity. It gave me definitely higher standards for what can be achieved naturally in my training. I also want to give a shout out to Yvonne with Squat Every Day, who taught me to think about my training more and consider the way my body feels. However, both of these channels have done plenty to confuse me as well, as Alex Leonidas runs the conjugate method but never spoke enough about the nuts and bolts of how it should be run for me to get a grasp on the system, despite watching him for years. And Yvonne, who definitely does not run basic periodization, and who feels his training out and seems to achieve PRs spontaneously and varies his work very significantly over time. He does not follow a set system. At some point I figured out that gaining muscle makes you stronger. And so strangely, I gravitated towards bodybuilding training as a way to get stronger. Another two shout-outs are natural hypertrophy and basement bodybuilding. Basement bodybuilding being very much an offshoot ideologically from natural hypertrophy, in my opinion, and I'm sure he would agree. NH often spoke about how powerlifting training misinforms bodybuilding training. I experienced the opposite, where listening to bodybuilders and people who train for hypertrophy actually made it difficult for me to get stronger. I don't think it was intentional on their part, but somewhere in the way I became confused, and I lost sight of what I wanted, which was to be strong. I wanted big squat, bench, deadlift, overhead press, pull up, a variety of lifts. I want to be stronger. And so these things confused me. Over the past months, I've begun to spend more time listening to people who care about strength first and foremost. Not completely cutting out bodybuilders, but listen far more to the strength athletes. Sam Sheether would be one of the first of these, who would bring up to me the idea of periodization as it's classically defined, as not something that is just, similar to conjugate or is a bad thing, like Yvonne would often say, because it's too unpredictable. Life is too unpredictable to be set within a 10-week block. I would find that that training is too unpredictable to be put within life. Sam Sheether would bring up this idea to me, but my insistence on intensity as a result of my bodybuilding influences would ultimately prevent me from learning much from it. However, at some point, when watching a video made by Alexander Bromley, another one of these strength-oriented channels, about a program made by Greg Nuckols, a one-time a week bench program, I would be introduced roughly to the idea of a 4-week wave scheme, or of a typical wave scheme, keeping top sets in and moving from light to heavy over a shorter period of time. 10 weeks left much more variability in my limited experience that I was not able to account for. Beginning with 10 reps brought me very far away from what I wanted, which was 1 rep. And it made it difficult for me to transition through phases. And I would often do quite well in the early phases, but always fall flat when it came to achieving a single. I'd find this would have just as much to do with the transition as it would to do with how I was executing the beginning phases. But this 4-week scheme would teach me something very important. And I would then hear Ben Johnson, who's just recently started to gain some popularity. Ben Johnson would talk about these shorter waves, blocks, which build upon one another in the basic way that 5-3-1 does. Obviously, with higher frequency and lower intensity per set. Ben would be instrumental as well in formulating my current program. I would implement Sam Sheether's programming tactic of using something of a daily undulating periodization with a new variation on each day of training a lift, and progressing them each individually up to a peak. With this in mind, I formulated a new program which took into account lowering intensity and pulling back before running up to a peak. And very simply, I would begin at 80% for sets of 5. This would later change to a top set at 80% and back offs at 75%. And then I would move on next week to 85%, 90%, and on the 4th week I would max out. Each week doing these relatively low intensity, relatively low rep back off sets for practice, accumulating a significant number of very clean touches throughout the week. These very basic training concepts, which have been around for a very long time. Alex Bromley's video is 6 years old, and in that video he attests that this is something which has existed since the beginning of time. Beginning, I had a hard time trusting, but I stuck to the system as I had many times before. Even when my plans had failed, I would stick to the plan, and so I stuck to this one. And I found that each cycle I would feel stronger and stronger. But until the weight on the bar told me that I was objectively better than before, I would not believe it. It would only be a few cycles later, when I would crush 255 quite easily, that I would truly have faith in what I had learned. And this brings me back to those original influences. Alex Leonidas, with his talk about strength is strength, increasing his deadlift without deadlifting and only doing good mornings. Ivan, with his insistence that typical periodization could not fit inside of a normal sporadic lifestyle. Neither of these things held true for me. Life would move around training rather than training moving around life. And I found that specificity was quite important, even for the bench press, which is a very non-technical lift. Sheether often talks about predictable progress and how he prefers progress which is set slowly on a timeline of sorts, where each cycle, depending on the work he puts in, he can expect some kind of small PR. 5 pounds every 10 weeks, adding up to 25 pounds in a year per lift, 75 pounds on a total in a year, and over a career building an impressive total this way. Not mentioning that, yes, you can do more, you can achieve more in 10 weeks. Rather than running many cycles without ever expressing a new PR, without ever achieving that new personal record, and then only achieving large PRs much further in the future. This is the type of training that somebody like Alex Leonidas, with his deadlifts were built by Good Mornings, and Ivan with his squat PRs built on years and years of very varying training with what seemed like no clear direction other than a whim. I have here in my notes that I need to mention Ivan's injury history as a factor in how sporadic his training is, where often he is seeking something therapeutic, and when he can achieve that therapeutic effect for his hip, which has always been the limiter for his strength, he can then move into a training style which produces the PRs, but never before then. This was not a problem for me. I have always been too weak to produce any stimulus, let alone produce an injury. Learning this way would end up being damaging to me as somebody who gains much slower than some of these people do. In my notes as well, I compare it to combat sports. Our sport of lifting is highly predictable in many cases. We choose the time, the place, the equipment, the load, the technique, how much we eat beforehand, how much we sleep beforehand, how much water we drink beforehand, the supplements we're using, the protein we're consuming. We control everything. Whereas in a sport like a combat sport, where maybe you'll step into the ring and despite all of your training, you'll get hit by somebody who hits harder than you've ever been hit. And you will fight somebody with a style which is different than you've ever seen. This produces mysticism and zealots who pray before their matches. Yes, they train, but they also pray. In a predictable sport like lifting, I don't see a need to pray. I don't see why we can't just control these understandable, predictable factors and produce an understandable, predictable result. I have no reason to believe that we can't. All this being said, that was only the first factor, periodization. which would lead to this, I can attest to a few more factors, aside from simply managing fatigue in a basic manner, that led to this. First of all, more time to hypertrophy the chest. We know that hypertrophy is a very slow adaptation to happen. This is based on genetic factors, our diet, our sleep, a variety of other things like our level of process generally, how we execute exercises, our capacity for work and volume, the time that we've been training. Probably the main factor in hypertrophy is simply how many hard, heavy sets have you put into the muscle group. This is likely king for, whether or not you grow. Not so much volume, really, if that volume is not sustainable over a long period of time. Either way, I spent a long time training my triceps to the point where my triceps are probably the only part of my body which appears muscular, impressively so at least. My arms grew an entire inch within the span of a year, and this did not improve my bench. However, when I began to train my chest, and it began to grow, it may have just started to begin to match up to my triceps in strength and size. And that may be one of the factors which influenced this. Another factor, I would say, is a technical one, being that I've begun to pause all of my volume on bench press. Pausing my volume was only possible because I let go of my ego and my understanding that more weight moved means bigger muscle, more strength. And pausing my bench presses would lead to more confidence in the bottom of the lift, which was ultimately where I failed, which again leads back to chest hypertrophy. Paused benches are more hypertrophic to the chest. A bigger chest supports the bottom. Having more technical proficiency, controlling the weight in the bottom, also compounds with that. All of this together, I believe, is what helped me to escape that bottom position sticking point that I had for a long time. Two other supplementary lifts, which would become my main lifts for the 2 other days of my training week, were the incline bench at a 30-degree angle and a 45-degree angle. The 30-degree incline bench would force a pec dominant bench by reducing my arch, which is quite severe. And this combined with a pause as well, assume everything in this list is paused now. Combining this with a pause would teach confidence in the pecs, build strength at length, and improve, again, just exaggerated, the same thing the pause bench did. Similarly, a pin bench, which would become my tertiary bench of sorts, would do the same thing except for from a full dead stop. This would teach explosive power, which would drive straight through the mid-range and allow me to finally reach the range where my overdeveloped triceps could lock out large lifts. Both of these are self-limiting variations, which may be how I've been able to continue running this program for so long with little change. Just as an aside, 2 other factors in my lifestyle have changed. This is getting more recent, but I've begun training Muay Thai in the mornings, and stretching and doing my cardio has greatly improved my squat, which is also at all-time strength, without any really intense direct hypertrophy work. Intermittently it has come in and out and may be a factor in my improved squat. But my recent superior trunk integrity, likely a part of following that same periodization and building that as an adaptation, insisting on better technique, but also stretching and cardio may have done some work to help we get more practice in better positions. So I can thank Muay Thai for my squatting success. And it may have had similar effects on my bench press, especially in terms of work capacity, as my number of sets for chest has gone up over time, and I've been able to maintain that. Another factor would be my recent increase in water intake and taking creatine, which are both pretty much one habit, but they were helped along by Muay Thai for sure, because I would become thirsty and it felt strange to drink soda at the gym. I have started since drinking at least 48 ounces of water every day and always taking my creatine. This may have been a small factor in the recent increases, or perhaps a very significant factor. Who knows? Another factor, nutrition, if you can call it that, may be my 10-pound weight gain. I don't mark this as a massive factor because it occurred before this phase and didn't seem to have any effect on my strength as it was happening, but definitely needs to be mentioned. I am floating around 230 to 235 pounds rather than 225 to 220 pounds. Around 10 pounds of weight gain. This fluctuates up and down as I do not have a very dialed in diet plan. But I have been working on meal prepping more, which has not been going on for long enough, in my opinion, to be a significant factor in my recent success. So, what do my future plans look like? How do I intend to keep this momentum going all the way, hopefully, to 315? Number one, everything stays the same. Don't change anything. If a hypertrophy exercise is still going up, it stays in. If a main progression, if a main lift is still going up, or even if it stagnates, but my main bench press continues to go up, it stays in. If I've been drinking 48 ounces of water, I drink 48 ounces of water. If I've been going to Muay Thai, I go to Muay Thai. If I've been 230 something pounds, I stay 230 something pounds. Everything stays the same until it stops working, and then we'll change it. Never even a moment beforehand. Little things can come in and out. My back training has varied. A little bit of my pec training has changed. But it is roughly the same. Lifted percentages get hit weekly. I monitor RPE to ensure that RPE is within a reasonable range. When RPE begins to change, or if it does, if my perception of load changes as the loads get absolutely heavier, I will adjust reps or percentages to accommodate. But ultimately, everything will stay as similar as possible for as long as possible. My sensation of training, my feeling around training physically has changed over the months as the loads have gotten absolutely larger. I am now to the point where I'm hitting PRs each and every week. This last week I benched 235 for 3 with a pause as my top set, with 1 or 2 reps in reserve, which was very well my target. Again, reps in reserve may have to increase later on as fatigue grows. I am feeling that fatigue grow. slightly. I won't alter anything until the PRs stop, which I don't see them stopping. Not yet, at least. But I may have to downregulate at some point. In addition to this, I have recognized that these microcycles do not stand alone, and they are a part of a macrocycle. Well, the blocks are a part of a larger structure, which is building fatigue over the course of many blocks. And I recognize as well that as I go to heavier weights and as I down-regulate repetitions, remove accessory work in the later stages, and essentially, remove volume from the program over time to continue necessitating growth, or strength gains, I should say, I recognize that I will be reducing the base building effect of my program. I believe right now it is quite evenly matched between technique, neural gain, and hypertrophy gain. I believe that they are quite even at the moment. However, in order to push the current base to its max level, I'll continue pushing the base up for as long as I can, but when it is necessary to pull back base building and sharpen the peak, I will do so, but I have to recognize that if that peak is not as high as I will be satisfied with, the peak being 315 or more, if there's more there, hate to be hopeful, but if the peak is not 315, I have to be ready to pull back again. Not over the course of a month, more like over the course of several months. Meaning returning to a lower percentage, increasing the length of my training blocks perhaps, or building lighter blocks on top of each other like I did the first time through to return to this point. Ultimately, I am incredibly optimistic about my training. I've not felt this optimistic about training in years. In the 3 years pretty much since my beginner phase. And even then, I had a horrendous mounting dread at its end the entire time. Regardless of if we fail the next 5 to 10 PR or pound PR this cycle, next cycle, or 5 cycles from now, I am incredibly satisfied with my training thus far. I will humble myself even further. I will improve my process to facilitate training harder for as long as possible rather than pulling back sooner. If I need to sleep more, I will sleep more. If I need to eat more protein, I will eat more protein. If I need to increase my accessory volume, I will increase my accessory volume. I will do anything to keep this going. And so, with that in mind, I will keep training. And I will check back in when we hit another snag, or when I hit 315.